Morning, church. What a blessing it is to be here today. That story reminded me of the old overhead transparencies we used to use in school. We used to draw and then change transparency and draw again. I'm sure some of the older folk would have remembered that. I thank the Lord for the invention of computers and graphics. It allows us to make our teaching a lot more entertaining. I'm going to be doing my sermon this morning on the story of Joseph. But before I start, I want to pose a question to you. How many of you have ever felt like life is unfair? I can tell you as a deputy principal working with teenagers that most of them feel like life is unfair. A lot of teenagers come to my office and say, life is just not fair. You know, my mom doesn't understand me, my dad doesn't understand me, I get too much homework. And I always tell them one thing, I say to them, wait until you leave school, you'll realize how unfair life can be. At the moment, you're getting fed and you have a roof over your head and you've got people that love you and care for you and you have structure to your day. I can't tell you that also the number of students I meet after that have left school and they say to me, Mr. Ellis, I just want to be back in school where I know what I'm doing for the day, I know that I've got some downtime, I know they've got some friends to connect with. But for us adults, generally, life can be very unfair. I remember arriving here from South Africa and didn't have a job, and my wife said to me, find a house. I only had 2 weeks before they arrived. She said, find a house, get a job, make sure you have a car, and when I arrive, make sure everything's sorted out. In 2 weeks, and those of you who've dealt with real estate agents, they're only open a rental for half an hour, and if you don't have a car, you basically give to one rental, and it's impossible. So I remember phoning home saying to Anne, it's an impossible task, life is really unfair. And she goes, what are you talking about? She's in the most beautiful country in the world and God has given us this wonderful blessing. And I thought back and said, yes, you know what? It is a blessing. And you have to sometimes stop and reflect. There was also one occasion when at Port Adelaide, I don't know if the bridge still moves. Does it still move across and close? It still does, yeah. So that was something amazing for us to see. And Anna just got here with the kids and we went for lunch. And I thought, I'll just stop the car quickly, get the kids out. They were fairly young and I'm going to show this bridge moving. And as we were watching the bridge move, I noticed a police officer come around, or it's one of those chaps that hand out tickets, and they're giving me a ticket for my car. I said, hey, I'm just stopped. I just want to watch the bridge with my kids. He goes, yeah, but just stopped in the wrong spot. And I said, can't believe life's so unfair. Just got this car, and I got a traffic fine for parking in the wrong place. But once again, I was stopped by my wife saying, just reflect on where you're at. What are we doing here? We've got our family. We feel safe. We're in this beautiful place, and yes, sometimes life gives you setbacks, and yes, sometimes life feels a little bit unfair, but if you take everything into perspective, you really are not that hard done by. I also wanted just to start, before I go into the story of Joseph, what a lot of people don't know about myself is I actually grew up in a little place, it's a little town called Edenvale. It's just outside Johannesburg. My father was the headmaster of Sehedi School, which is the South African Hellenic Technical Institute, which is a large Greek school in Johannesburg. And his chairman of the board was a gentleman called Advocate George Bezos. Now, if you know political movements and you've listened to in the early days of the UN, you would have known that Advocate George Bezos was actually Nelson Mandela's lawyer in the day. And my father and George were quite a large movement in that they used to support the movement for Nelson Mandela, even while he was in prison. And even at a stage where they actually brought an African child and put him in the school, and my father was arrested for that. But the whole time, my father used to say to me, Nicholas, always remember what's important in life. To treat people equally, to love the Lord, and make sure you're always giving blessings to someone else. And he used to keep that in our home, and he used to make sure that we lived that. We lived that for when we dealt with people, no matter what their background was, no matter what the color of their skin was, even their religious beliefs, always treat someone with respect, love, compassion. And the reason I'm telling you that is because I'd like to draw a parallel today between Joseph and Nelson Mandela. Both these stories, I feel, have some really important lessons for us to understand. Now, if you don't know about Joseph, well, let me give you a little background. Nelson Mandela, let me give you a little background. He was born in 1918 in a village called Mavuso in South Africa, and he was given the name, which a lot of people actually don't know, it's called Rolishashla. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly because it's Koza, but his parents named him that name, and directly translated the name means pulling the branch of a tree, and which is more colloquially known in the village as being a troublemaker. So he's actually named a troublemaker by his parents. The name Nelson was actually given to him when he attended his first day at school. Now, Nelson, when he woke up on his first day of school, he tells the story in some of his articles, is that he actually didn't have clothes for school. He had a dirty old shirt, and he had some really broken pants, and his father wanted him to actually go to school looking quite smart. So his father gave him a big pair of his pants, and they were huge. And Nelson tells a story where his father just said, okay, he folded up the bottoms, and he just put a piece of string around him. So the comedy behind it, he says he must have looked like Mount Nelson, traveling the seas and going to attack, etc., for the British. But the name was actually given to him by his teacher. And he stayed with that name, and he kept it. And most people know him as Nelson Mandela. Now, as for Joseph, he was born in Paddan Aram, which is known as Haran, which is located in the region of the modern-day northern Syria, which is now southern Turkey. This is where Jacob, his father, had lived for many years while working for Laban, his uncle, where he married Rachel, Joseph's mother. Joseph's birth is recorded in Genesis 30, verses 22 to 24, where Rachel finally bore a son after many years of being childless. So both of these men, Joseph and Nelson Mandela, faced incredible adversities. They were never allowed their circumstances to define them. Instead, they trusted that God had a bigger plan. They persevered with grace and courage, and their stories teach us how to navigate our own struggles, no matter what life throws at us. In Jeremiah 29, verse 11, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Joseph's journey begins with family drama, and I'm sure many of us can relate to that. He was his father's favorite, and his father, Jacob, didn't exactly hide it. Jacob gave Joseph the most beautiful, colorful coat, a coat that symbolized a special status in the family. Now imagine how Joseph's brothers felt about this. They were jealous. They saw Joseph getting special treatment, and it burned them up inside. I'll give you a personal example of this. In my family, we had our own little version of this dynamic. I was one of 3 brothers, and my youngest brother, Gregory, every year he'd write a little Christmas list, and every year under that Christmas tree he'd get exactly what he asked for. My older brother too, he wouldn't ask for much, but whatever he wrote down, he'd get exactly what he asked for. And I remember one Christmas that all I'd been asking for, I'd been prompting my parents throughout the year, remote control boat, remote control boat, remote. Every time I saw a remote control boat, I pointed it out to them. But sure enough, my younger brother heard it. And my younger brother was 5 years younger than myself, and he had written on his list, remote control boat. So my parents, my wonderful parents, who loved my younger brother, who thought he couldn't defend for himself, they bought for him a remote control boat, and they gave me a chessboard. Now, I didn't mind the chessboard, but I don't remember the prompting them for a chessboard. I don't remember asking them for a chessboard. And I remember sitting across from him going, that's actually my remote control boat. I can't believe you got a remote control boat. And it kind of gave me a little inkling when I was writing the sermon as to what Joseph's brothers must have felt when he got this beautiful technicolored coat. And what were they wearing? Just rags that they go out into the field. So like Joseph's story, Gregory didn't do anything to deserve my frustration. But it was not hard to feel jealous. Joseph didn't help matters either. And this is, I love this part of the story, because he started having dreams that showed his brothers bowing down to him. And he made no mistake in telling them, let's be honest, if your sibling told you that one day you're going to bow down to them, you wouldn't be thrilled. And jealousy took hold of Joseph's brothers. They were so angry, they plotted to get rid of him. And one day when Joseph came to check on them in the fields, they threw him into a pit and later sold him to traders on their way to Egypt. They faked his death and told their father Jacob that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. You can imagine the level of betrayal. Your own brothers selling you into slavery and leaving you for dead. Now, I can tell you, I never felt that for my brother, but there were certainly days that he pushed. But always we do things in love. Jealousy is a dangerous emotion in today's world. It's easy to feel jealous. We live in a culture of comparison, where we are constantly looking at what others have, whether it is their popularity on social media, their grades, their talents, or their lifestyle. But when we let jealousy take root, it can lead us to make choices we regret. And I can tell you from working again in schools, how much a part that actually plays in our youth's lives nowadays. They're constantly re-evaluating their lives against these images on TikTok, against people on Instagram, against green screen filters that put imaginary houses and cars in their background, and young girls that are filtered so much that they look like supermodels. That's what our youth are putting up with. They're creating a whole generation of people wanting more and having a feeling of jealousy. Even Ellen G. White writes, jealousy is the most dangerous passion if cherished. It quickly becomes the master of the soul. This is a reminder from Ellen to guard our heart against jealousy and to remember that God has a unique plan for each of us. Now let's look at Nelson Mandela's life. Mandela too grew up in full division, where people were often treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. In apartheid South Africa, there was a great divide between the white minority and the black majority. And Mandela witnessed the pain of injustice firsthand. Despite the systematic racism and oppression, Mandela dreamed of a South Africa where people could live together as equals. He knew that holding on to resentment and jealousy would only lead to division and violence. Instead, like Joseph, Mandela kept his vision of something greater. And when he saw injustice around him, instead of letting it make him bitter, he decided to act and to stand up against inequality. Just as Joseph's brothers' jealousy led them to betray him, the South African government betrayed the ideals of equality and justice by upholding apartheid. Mandela's fight for freedom eventually led to his arrest, where he was thrown into prison for 27 years. And I can tell you, I've actually visited that prison, and it's not larger than just this area here where the piano and keyboard are. That's where he spent 27 years, looking out to the bars, and when he wasn't in there, he was hitting bricks in the quarry. But we'll see with Joseph that Nelson Mandela's imprisonment did not define him. Instead, both men allowed God to work in their lives, trusting that there was a greater plan in motion. After Joseph was sold into slavery, he ended up in Egypt, where he was bought as a slave by a man named Potiphar. Joseph had every reason, by Potiphar. But instead of giving up and letting anger consume him, Joseph chose to work hard with Potiphar and to honor God. He chose to work in the household. He did everything right. And it looked like just things were turning around for Joseph and life was getting better. But suddenly there was a curveball. Potiphar's wife took notice of Joseph and tried to seduce him. Joseph, being a man of integrity, refused her advances. He knew that giving in would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against God. Potiphar's wife became angry and rejected and falsely accused Joseph of assault. And Potiphar, believing his wife's lies, had Joseph thrown into prison. Now think about that for a minute. Joseph had done everything right. He had stayed faithful to God, resisted temptation, and worked hard. And yet, instead of being rewarded, he was thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. Many of us can relate to moments like that in our own lives. Moments where we've done everything right, but life still seems unfair. Maybe you've been kind to someone, only to have them turn against you. Maybe you've worked hard at school or at a job, only to see the results you hope for not be there. It can be frustrating, and it's easy to feel like giving up. Mandela faced a similar trial. He had worked tirelessly for justice, but instead of being rewarded for his efforts, he was branded a criminal and sent to prison. During this time, Mandela had every reason to become bitter. He was separated from his family, confined to a small cell, and treated less than a human. But just like Joseph, Mandela chose a path of integrity. He didn't let prison break his spirit. Instead, he used his time in prison to reflect and to grow and to strengthen his resolve. He knew that despite the injustice he faced, his cause was just, and that gave him the strength to endure. But Joseph and Mandela teach us a powerful lesson here. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't bring immediate rewards. Sometimes it feels like we're being punished for our faithfulness. But just because we don't see the results right away doesn't mean God isn't working behind the scenes. Ellen White reminds us that faith is tested in trial. And when it holds fast to God, it wins the crown of life. I love that statement. Faith is tested in trial. You know, when I read a statement like that, I'm reminded of when someone is sick in the family. When we come upon hardships, what's the first thing we do? Is we turn to God. We turn to God and we say, help us in this situation. When faith is tested in trial, it holds fast to God and it wins the crown of life. Joseph trusted God's plan, and Mandela trusted the work for freedom and justice would not be in vain, even when everything around them seemed hopeless. There's a lovely verse in Romans 5, verses 3-4, where it says, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that the sufferings produce perseverance, character, and character, hope. While Joseph was in prison, he encountered two men who had been thrown in prison by Pharaoh, his cupbearer and his baker. One night, both men had troubled dreams, and Joseph, who had been given the gift of interpreting dreams, offered to help them. He accurately predicted and interpreted the dreams, telling the cupbearer he would be restored to his position, and warning the baker he would be executed. And just as Joseph said, it happened. The cupbearer left prison, and the baker was executed. And just before the cupbearer left, Joseph said, please, please don't forget me. Say a good word to Pharaoh when you meet him. And the cupbearer said, okay. But he did forget. Just like sometimes we do things in our lives, and we hope that people remember the good deeds that we do. But sometimes they do forget. And so Joseph remained in prison for 2 more years. 2 years of waiting and wondering when his breakthrough would come. Many of us have experienced times of waiting, but you've been waiting for an answer to prayer, waiting for change in your circumstances, waiting for something good to happen in your life. Waiting is hard, especially when it feels like everyone else is moving forward. But Joseph teaches us an important truth. God's delays are not his denials. Just because something isn't happening right now doesn't mean it won't happen. Sometimes God allows us to go through periods of waiting to prepare us for what's ahead. Similarly, Nelson Mandela spending 27 years in prison of waiting, wondering if freedom would come for him and his people. But even in waiting, Mandela didn't lose hope. Like Joseph, he trusted that this time was a time of trial and purpose. While he waited, Nelson Mandela studied, learned, and prepared for the future. While he waited, he prayed. And he left it upon the Lord to do the work for him in the background. So often I've stood up here and I say we pray, and then as humans we take it back. We say, God, please help me, and then we try and resolve the issue ourselves. I know of 3 times in my life, one when my child was sick, one when I lost my job here in Australia, and I was looking for advice, and one when I just needed direction. And when I gave it to God, and I said, right, it's yours, because nothing I can do, I had wonderful resolve. And only afterwards, and looking back, I can see the work he was doing for me. So I plead with you today, when you pray and give it to God, let him have it. Trust in his work. Anyway, as we know, Pharaoh had a dream, and he couldn't get these dreams resolved. All the chaps in his kingdom, all the specialists and all the intelligent fellows could not understand his dreams. So the cupbearer remembered Joseph and said to the Pharaoh, I know a chap who's in prison. I know someone who can help you interpret your dreams. And how amazing. How amazing. One day, someone goes from prison to prime minister through God's work. The Pharaoh explained. He said, hey, man, I've got these dreams. These 7 years. And Joseph interpreted them as the 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph didn't only interpret them. He said to Pharaoh, this is how, with these dreams, you need to understand and prepare and plan. Pharaoh was so impressed by Joseph's wisdom that he made him the second most powerful man in Egypt. That's how quickly God changed our circumstance. So after years of waiting, Joseph was rewarded. He went from darkness of the prison to the highest position in Egypt. But here's the important part. Joseph didn't let his newfound power go to his head. He didn't use his position to seek revenge or glorify himself. Instead, Joseph used his gifts and position to serve others, helping Egypt prepare for the famine and ultimately saving countless lives. Nelson Mandela had a similar experience. After the 27 years, he was released in 1990. And I can tell you that the whole country waited in bated breath. The minority thought, hang man, we've had this man in prison 27 years. He's going to come out and he's going to destroy those who put him in prison. He's going to overnight change things. He's going to be hated. He's going to have so much aggression and anger for us. We didn't. He came out, and I remember seeing a wonderful, there's a photo that was in the newspaper and the headlines the following day, because he didn't only have his wife with him, Winnie, he also had some of the white political figures at the time with him too, and he's holding their hands. He was holding their hands in celebration, in unity. And I thought, how amazing. At the time, I thought, how amazing, how incredible this man is. That he's going to bring a nation together, not pull it apart. Because he understood that it was through him and through the blessings that he was able to give, the same as Joseph to Egypt. It's an important reminder that we all have unique gifts and talents. We all have something we can share with someone else, even if it's just love. I once heard a young person in our chapel service, and I think I've mentioned it here before, that is the one thing we can give that we never can have empty. You know, you give money and eventually you get to the end of your money. But love, you can continue giving the next person. You give as much love to the next person as you gave the person before. And I thought, what a wonderful gift from God is that's the one raw thing we can continuously give other people. So Joseph's story obviously doesn't end there. The famine spread, not only Egypt, but also across the surrounding lands. Joseph's family back in Canaan were suffering too. And so they were sent to Egypt to buy food. And when they arrived, they didn't recognize Joseph. But Joseph recognized them. His brothers bowed down before him, just like the dreams he had as a boy. And now, if you were Joseph, how would you react in that moment? These are the same brothers who betrayed him, sold him into slavery, caused years of pain in his life. Joseph had the power to punish them, to get revenge. But, like Mandela, he chose forgiveness. When Joseph finally revealed to his identity his brothers, they were terrified. They said to him, "You intend to harm us?" Joseph said, "No. You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what now has been done in the saving of many lives." Joseph understood that even through his brothers and even through all that hurt, God had used those painful experiences to bring about a greater plan. And that's key to forgiveness. When we forgive, we are saying that the other person, what they did was not okay, but we forgive them. We're saying that to trust God is to bring the good out of even the worst situations. In Ephesians 4, verse 31 to 32, it says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you." Forgiveness is hard. It's not easy, especially for us humans. Letting go of anger, resentment, the desire for revenge is easy, especially when the wounds are deep. But Joseph shows us forgiveness is a path to healing, not just for the person who hurt us, but for ourselves. When we hold on to bitterness, it keeps us chained to the past. But when we forgive, we open a door of healing and allow God to work in our hearts. Ellen G. White expresses this beautifully when she says, "Only by love is love awakened. True forgiveness brings forth reconciliation and peace." Joseph's life is a powerful reminder that no matter what challenges we face, whether it is betrayal, unfair circumstance, or the need to forgive, God is always with us. He is always working behind the scenes, and even when we can't see it, and like Joseph, we need to trust. In the same way, Nelson Mandela's life shows us that even in the face of tremendous injustice, God can work through us to bring about healing, peace, and reconciliation. So as we reflect on the lives of Joseph and Nelson Mandela, I encourage you to think about the challenges you are facing in your own life. Maybe you've been hurt by someone you trusted. Maybe it's a difficult season awaiting for you. Or maybe you feel like life isn't fair. Whatever it is, Joseph and Nelson Mandela's stories teach that God is with us in every season, whether we're in the pit, the prison, or the palace. God uses every experience to shape us into who He created us to be. Joseph went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and years of waiting. Mandela endured years of oppression, separation from his family, and just imprisonment. But through it all, God was refining their characters, preparing them for a greater purpose. God is working in your life, have no doubt. In the moments you feel most painful, He's there holding you. I want you to ask yourself today, what can I give up? What burdens can I give away by simply saying, I forgive, I love? Please, God, take this. One of the hardest lessons we learnt in life is that our trials are often very things God uses to prepare us for greater. In Romans 8:28, we're reminded that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This means that nothing is wasted, not our pain, not our waiting, not our mistakes. God's using it all to fulfill His purpose. As I close, I encourage you to give your trials to God. Trust that He's working right now in the midst of your circumstances, even when it's hard to see. Ask Him for strength and to stay faithful, for the patience to wait on His timing, and the grace to forgive those who wronged you. Just as He was with Joseph and Nelson, He is with you. And just as He turned their trials into triumph, He can do the same for you. There's a beautiful quote by Nelson Mandela that says, "It always seems impossible until it's done." Thank you very much. God bless.